Okay, section 9.6 is where we are going to be using the quadratic formula to solve our quadratic equations. So the quadratic formula is opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So what that is, you are going to be plugging in numbers for a, b, and c, just like we have to find the vertex, and then solve it out in order to find what your two answers could be. So let's run through some examples. So here's my first one, x squared minus 8 equaling 2x. My first job is I have to make sure that this is always equal to 0. So if there is something over here, we're going to do the opposite of it to move it to the other side. So I would minus 2x from both sides so that that would cancel out to 0. So since there is nothing to combine that negative 2x with, I just rewrote it in standard form. So I would have x squared minus 2x minus 8 equaling 0. Okay, so now remember that a is your first number, b is the second, c is the third. So off to the side here, I just wrote them out. A is 1, b is negative 2, c is negative 8. So the biggest thing is making sure you have the correct numbers. That's step 1. Step 2 now, we're going to plug it into our formula. So our formula says opposite of b, so that means I'm going to change my sign, plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So I was just plugging in my numbers where I saw a, b, and c up here in my original formula. Now we're going to do some simplifying. You are going to want to do order of operations. So that means you must always start with simplifying what's underneath the square root first. If you want to type this into your calculator as one big string, you must make sure you put in an extra set of parentheses right here where you times those 3. Okay? So you would do parenthesis, negative 2, parenthesis squared, minus, and then another set of parentheses, 4 times 1 times negative 8, and then close that parenthesis. Because you want to make sure you're timesing all of these before you subtract it from this. So I went ahead and did it differently. I went ahead and just simplified my exponent, then I times those, and then I ended up subtracting. So it's up to you. If you like typing it in as one big string, you may do it that way. Otherwise, you need to do order of operations. So exponents and then multiplication. Now, that piece right there where you have a subtraction with a negative, make sure you pay attention to that because that means I'm going to end up getting a positive 36. Then I can do the square root of 36, which gives me just 6. So the only thing I've done so far is I did the square root simplification, and I went ahead and just times the 2 times 1 in the bottom. Okay? Now, at this point, when you've simplified it to here, this plus or minus means you technically have 2 problems that you have to solve out. You have to do 2 plus 6 on the top and then divide by 2. You also need to do 2 minus 6 and then divide by 2. So remember when we were solving with square roots or we graphed it, there's always 2 answers. So that's why it's giving you a plus and a minus. So now I can just simplify both of those. This would give me 8 over 2. This would be negative 4 over 2. So my 2 answers would be 4 and negative 2. Now, if that was kind of a complex situation, you may want to pause it and kind of re-watch that video part on how to do that quadratic formula. Otherwise, I would go ahead and try the next one and see if you can get the correct answer. Now, I would check if I had the A, B, and C correct before you start plugging it in. Okay, so in the got it question, I hope that you subtracted 21 first because we have to have it equal to 0. Then you're going to start plugging in your A, B, and C. So this is what it should look like if you plugged in A, B, and C correctly. So double check your steps because this process has multiple steps. Now you can type it in as one big string, so that means you need to make sure you have an extra set of parentheses around those 3 numbers. Or you can do it my way where I do the exponent, which is 16. I leave the minus sign and then I times all 3 of those numbers together. Then I combine those. So if you typed it in as one big string, you should be getting 100 underneath that square root. Once you've done everything underneath the square root, then I actually do the square root, so the square root of 100 is just 10. Now remember that plus or minus means I have two problems I have to do. So I have to do 4 plus 10 on top and 4 minus 10. So now I'm going to simplify. I get 14 over 2 and negative 6 over 2, so I get up 7 and negative 3. Now these have been nice numbers so far where they've turned out to be whole numbers. There will be times where you end up getting some fractions, so you want to leave them in fraction form and just reduce them as much as possible. Okay, so that's solving using the quadratic formula. Now you're going to use the discriminant within your quadratic formula to tell you how many real solutions you may have. So at the top of your the back page, I should say, the discriminant is just the part that's under your square root. So this b squared minus 4ac, that's actually what the discriminant is. So you may make that note that when it asks you to find the discriminant, you're just finding what's underneath the square root. So the b squared minus 4ac, that part of the formula is your discriminant. Now all of this notation is kind of tricky, so I just narrowed it down for you. This one is saying that it's positive. Whenever your discriminant is a positive number, that means you're going to have two real solutions. Whenever your discriminant ends up being 0, that means you have one solution. Whenever your discriminant ends up being negative, that means you have no solutions. So let's try doing one of those and see if that makes sense here. So on this first problem, I see that I have it not equal to 0. So the first thing I would want to do is add that 5 to the other side. So my new equation would say 2x squared minus 3x plus 5. Now I would divvy out what my a, b, and c are. So a is 2, b is negative 3, c is 5. Then I would plug it into my discriminant formula. So my discriminant formula is b squared minus 4ac. So I would plug those numbers in, and I would have negative 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times 5. Again, you are welcome to type this in as one big string, but you want to make sure you have an extra set of parentheses right there. So I must have parentheses here, and then I have to have that extra set right there. So my discriminant ends up being negative 31. Since it's negative, since my number ended up being a negative number, up at the top it said that if my discriminant was negative, then that means I have no real solutions. So for my final answer then, I would say no real solutions. Okay, pause the video, see if you can find the discriminant in the got it question and find how many solutions. Okay, so in the got it question, I hope you subtracted 7 over first because this has to be equal to 0. Then you find your a, b, and c. Then I plug it into my discriminant, so you should be getting negative 5 squared minus, and then this whole quantity, 4 times 6 times negative 7. You should end up with 193 as your discriminant. Since that is a positive number, that's the first column up here at the top. So that means I would end up getting two real solutions. Okay, quadratic formula is a bit tedious just because there's so many steps into it, so just take your time and make sure you pay attention to all of your negatives and your computations.